So should religion play a larger role in American public life, or is there an argument to be made for the absolute separation of church and state? Joining me now with their takes are Reverend Stephen Baines. He's the Director of Religious Outreach at Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, and Galen Carey, Vice President of Government Relations at the National Association of Evangelicals. Gentlemen, welcome to the heat. Let's start there. Should religion be playing a larger role? I'll start with you, Galen.
Well, certainly we know that most Americans are religious. 4 out of 5 have a specific denomination, and most of the rest are spiritual in one way or another. So it's inevitable that people of faith are going to be involved in public life, and I think that's a good thing.
Stephen?
Well, I think what we have to learn about the Pew Forum is the poll shows us that we are still a very religiously diverse kind of country. And our organization believes that the absolute separation of church and state is needed because we're becoming increasingly more multicultural. Different religions and different ethnicities are coming into this country. And if we don't have that strict wall of separation of church and state, we are going to find that there's going to be more persecution and more discrimination against these religious minorities.
Should it be absolute, Galen?
Well, our founders were very wise when they crafted the First Amendment. As you know, that establishes that we have to, that the government is not allowed to establish any religion, very important, and that it can't make any laws preventing us from practicing our religion as citizens. So the restrictions are all on the government. The government should not be interfering in religion. But nobody is saying that people of faith should have to check their religion at the door when they enter the public square, because faith values have a lot to say about how we solve our common problems.
Is the United States secular more in theory than in practice?
I believe it very much so is. Now, many of us believe that the secular concept of our government, and I would remind our guest, our Constitution has not a single word about God or faith or religion in it, except for the religious litmus test, that there should be no religious litmus test for elected office. But you noticed in the Democratic and Republican conventions, the parties were tripping over themselves to make sure that they dripped with faith language and God language. And when we can't tell the difference between religion in this country and our Democratic and Republican parties, we've really deteriorated at least part of that wall.
I want to give you a chance to respond.
Sure, there's very few people in our country who don't believe in God. There are some, and their rights need to be respected, but so should the rights of those who do believe in God. They should be able to live and to engage in public affairs in the same way and on the same basis as anyone else.
You know, you talked about this litmus test. I want to get both of you to respond to this, and I'm sure you probably are familiar with it. According to a religious identification survey, this was done by Trinity College, 50% of Americans identified themselves as Protestant, a quarter identified themselves as Catholic, and analysts agree that American voters would quickly reject a candidate who does not believe in God. In fact, William Galston, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, has been quoted as saying a candidate running for office would have a better chance as a former member of the Taliban than as an atheist. And I want to see how you guys feel about that, Stephen.
Sure, I'll start because I was just in a conversation with some friends around watching the Democratic and Republican conventions. And when the God controversy on the Democratic Party came out, one of my friends looked at me and said, you know, I bet we would elect an openly gay person for president than we would an atheist. And that's kind of sad that atheism in this country is so discriminated and has such a stigma attached to it. I'm a Baptist, and I worship every Sunday, but I believe that this country should enjoy the same freedoms for atheism as they do for my religion.
Galen?
Certainly, I'd agree with that. There shouldn't be a religious litmus test for any office. What's important is that there are important moral issues at stake, and so voters have the right to know how their prospective leaders would address moral questions as well as economic and other issues, and let people explain their views and then make the right decisions.
You know, I was at the rally for Mitt Romney not too long ago in Northern Virginia, and one of the people there, I overheard a conversation, just hearing a snippet. He said, this really isn't an election, this is spiritual warfare. And he said, you know, I don't feel like Obama's on the dark side, but if he can be drawn that way. Is it interesting that elections can be framed that way and that people can feel so strongly about their religious beliefs that they can castigate one person as being in the evil camp versus the other? Galen?
Well, we have many issues that our country is facing. Poverty, for example, 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 6 Americans living in poverty. That's a moral issue. So the question is, how should issues like that be addressed? And for example, Christians have specific instructions on how we should care for the poor. So that's an issue that needs to be raised and talked about. And frankly, whether a person is a Christian or not doesn't necessarily tell us how they will deal with issues like that.
Spiritual warfare, though, those are kind of tough, incendiary words, aren't they?
Well, I'm really increasingly angered by the kinds of terminology that I think the religious right is using in this country. Spiritual warfare, we have a lie out there in America that President Barack Obama, because his middle name is Hussein, is a Muslim. Still, 25% of Americans think that he's a Muslim. Not that there's anything wrong with Islam, but the fact that they would tell such a lie, a dogmatic lie, to try to divide this country even further. Because I agree with Galen, there are a lot more social issues that I think people on both sides of the aisle want to hear about. They want to hear who has the best economic policies. They want to hear how we're going to do green energy and control climate change. They're not so much interested in these catchphrases like spiritual warfare.
At the same time, we should remember that we do live in a world that does have evil in it. There are things like human trafficking where people are held in slavery. That's evil and that's wrong. It needs to stop. And so if people are wanting to address spiritual issues like that, I don't think that's inappropriate. I do think that the language that we choose for public discourse should be one that's accessible to all.
Should a leader in any church be telling the flock which way to vote? Is that a good idea?
I personally think it's unwise. The First Amendment does give us freedom of speech, but if a pastor wants to have a church where people of different parties can feel comfortable coming together, it's probably unwise to be making partisan statements.
Stephen, I guess you'd agree with that one.
I would agree 100%. We absolutely do not believe that it is the purpose of the clergy and houses of worship across our land to further divide people. It's not only bad public policy, but it's bad for religious expression. And I think the country is already divided. We don't need our ministers and our priests and our rabbis further dividing this country.
Back in the 1970s, Jerry Falwell, of course, out there on the national stage, we heard about the Christian Coalition, the moral majority. Have we seen that influence wane, do you think, or is it just as influential, Galen?
Well, I think that Christians in particular have gone through phases of political involvement, and we've made some mistakes. Evangelicals have made a lot of mistakes. I think what we see now is that there's a much more mature engagement on the part of many evangelical Christians. We're looking at the whole range of issues. The NE has a document called For the Health of the Nation, which lays out several issues that should be important to Christians as we go to the polls.
Stephen, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
I do think the Christian Coalition has faded, but as you look at the Tea Party especially, and you look at polls that have identified their demographics, they're just the Christian Coalition reborn in this Tea Party. Their demographics show that they're overwhelmingly identified as evangelical, right-wing extremists in this country.
I just have to say that evangelicals are not all right-wing. The evangelicals are found all across the spectrum, just as with other faith groups.
And I would agree with that.
Okay, any predictions for this election?
I'll give you the first word.
Well, we pray that God will lead all the voters, and we pray for our leaders, whoever is elected. We'll pledge to pray for them so that God can use them as the leaders of our country.
That's almost the politician talking there. No consensus for one or the other.
Well, I think both of us are in organizations that really are prohibited from endorsing political candidates. Unlike the Pulpit Freedom Sunday that happened this Sunday, we at Americans United for Separation of Church and State will abide by our tax-exempt status and not endorse a candidate.
Well, I think you gave us a great segue there. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for coming in. Certainly appreciate it.